Well, from a race in France that had almost nothing to a race just a week later in Austria that had pretty much everything. I absolutely loved it, and I know that many of you guys did too. Thank you for all your responses in relation to that. I'll be giving away at the end of this video that amazing Max Verstappen print from Alex Stutchbury and the GPbox.com. And by the way, how perfect a prize to give away this weekend was that. There are loads of F1 related questions to get through, so welcome to another Ask Elvis. Right, let's start with this one from Thomas Ashley. Thomas says, how was Max Verstappen able to go so quickly through the race and the Mercs and Ferraris be absolutely nowhere? Well, Thomas, first of all, I don't think the Ferraris were nowhere. Sebastian was well out of position, so yes, he struggled a lot more. But Charles Leclerc drove a great race with what he had. I think we'll touch on this in more detail a bit later, but I think Ferrari's decision to qualify on the soft tyre was definitely well, was it a mistake? In hindsight, it probably was a mistake because they ran out of tyre life towards the end of the race, and that's why he was swallowed up by Max. And that's really the story there, because Max Verstappen was able to pit a lot later than the Ferraris, which meant that come the end of the race, he had much fresher tyres, and that was the biggest pace difference was between the two tyre lives. Charles Leclerc was on much older tyres by the end of the race, and that all kind of is traced back, of course, that decision to qualify on the soft tyre. So that was that. The Mercedes were just heavily compromised in terms of temperature. The car was overheating from right early on, from sort of I think less than lap 5, they were already into overheating issues and having to manage that. And when I say managing that, I'm talking about they just could not run at full pace. They couldn't run fast enough, they couldn't turn the engine up fast enough. So I don't think it's a sign that the Ferraris and the Mercs were nowhere. I mean, yes, they were in relative pace terms, but those are the reasons. So I'm just waiting to cross a busy road here before I get run over. So I think Max Verstappen, first of all, drove a great race, like a really great race. He had the bit between his teeth after that terrible start, and that's when we love to see Max, don't we? When he's kind of almost angry and determined to prove a point in the car, and prove a point he did. He drove one of the best races I've seen him race, probably ever, and I think one of the best drives that we've seen in Formula One for a long time yesterday. Let's not underestimate how good Max Verstappen was, both in terms of maturity, in keeping the tyres alive, in keeping out of too much trouble, and we'll get into the incident towards the end, I'm sure, in a little while. But he drove a fantastic race. The Mercedes were heavily compromised. Ferrari were compromised because of their tyre strategy. And Honda, Red Bull and Max Verstappen just got it right. Right, I've just arrived at the set for this Wheeler Dealer's Dream Car filming that we're doing again today. But I will pick this up shortly and answer some more questions. Right, Brad Sams asks, he says, hi Mark, why do Red Bull have such good performance relative to other teams when engine cooling is required? Also referring back to Mexico. And similarly, why do Mercedes seem to struggle in such situations? Well, look, Mercedes clearly had some massive limitations yesterday in terms of temperature management, and that can just be the fundamental design of their car and the cooling systems on it. They opened everything out, all the exit ducts as wide as they could. I mean, I've seen teams, I've done it myself, where you just literally have to go beyond all of the options that you have from the design and start cutting massive holes in the bodywork. And I think they were doing that over the weekend, trying to get as much airflow through as they could, and still they could not get the temperatures down to a level that would allow them to operate at full power and at full performance. So that was what happened to Mercedes. In terms of Red Bull, clearly they have a car that is able to do those things. So it is able to operate at the right temperatures under those conditions. And that can be a fundamental design feature of the aero of each car. You know, normally actually Adrian Newey, designer of the Red Bull, is one of those that it's one of those that will actually absolutely compromise things like cooling to maximise aerodynamic benefit. So actually you often find that an Adrian Newey car will suffer with its cooling because he's focused everything on getting performance gain from the aero, and cooling often and things like that become secondary. But it doesn't look like that's happened this time, so Red Bull seems to be able to operate at full power, and that's big credit to Honda as well as it is to Red Bull. And that was probably the biggest difference yesterday. One of the biggest reasons, in fact the biggest single reason that Mercedes struggled yesterday was all about temperatures. You know, for once this wasn't all about tyre performance, it was about temperatures that hobbled Mercedes. And actually one of the biggest reasons for having a great race yesterday was the fact that the team that in recent races, in fact in every race so far this season, that have dominated everything, weren't able to operate at their full performance potential. Mercedes were pegged back massively, and that's possibly one of the biggest reasons that we had a great race yesterday, because the rest of the field are much closer, and the favourites were brought back into the pack and therefore struggling at much lower power than they otherwise would be running. So, you know, what does that say about the future of Formula One? What do we need to do? Do we need to find ways to peg back the leaders? I mean, I've seen all sorts of suggestions about what we should be doing, and we had this big debate about should we be reverting back to the tyres that we had last year to try and, you know, negate that advantage that Mercedes has had. I don't think that's what we should be doing. I think yesterday was just a little glimpse into what we have in Formula One when we don't have one team dominating. It was a real mixture of performance. It was a mixture of kind of qualifying and strategy, and we had a little bit of everything. The circuit, of course, played a huge part in that as well. It's a great circuit, old school. All the elements came together. It was a perfect storm that gave us a perfect race. Right, Mark Jones asked this one. He says, Mark, do you think it was an error by Ferrari to start Leclerc on the soft tyre? He had to stop 10 laps or so earlier than Verstappen, and that looked to prove decisive at the end of the race. Well, it absolutely was decisive, wasn't it? Was it an error? Probably was with a bit of hindsight, but actually at the time, I must admit, I thought it was such a close call, it was worth taking the risk. It put him on the front row, don't forget, so it gave him the best shot at the start of that race, and perhaps with slightly different tyre management, he might have been able to hang on, but it was so close between starting on the medium and starting on the soft that I think it was a fair gamble to take, but ultimately, looking back with a bit of hindsight, yeah, of course it was an error. In the end, it lost him the race. Jack Yellen says, best race in such a long time. I really enjoyed this one, but how is it possible that Max lapped Gasly? Well, that is a question that a lot of people are asking, probably Pierre Gasly himself. He's just struggling so much right now to get the best out of that Red Bull, where Max is at the opposite end of that scale. He's got everything working right, he's got supreme confidence, he's got the tyres working, he's got everything working. He feels at one with that car, and Pierre is still really struggling to get used to what might be some fairly unique characteristics of that car compared to what he's been used to. I touched on this before in a previous video, but he's got a limited amount of time and a limited amount of patience at that Red Bull team, particularly from somebody like Helmut Marko. How long is he going to give Pierre Gasly to get to grips with that car before he starts looking at someone else to fill that seat? I don't think very long. He's got to buck his ideas up because Max is at the top of his game. Pierre is somewhere near the bottom of his. Right, that was a sneak peek inside the Wheeler Dealers Dream Car Workshop, by the way, which I will be able to show you in more detail very shortly, so anyone who's interested in that, I'll give you a proper tour before long. Anyway, let's get on with more questions, and Martin Strumpfer asks this one. He says, I have a question on steward consistency. Even though no penalty is 100% the correct call to me, they penalised a lesser incident in F3 today, and in Canada there wasn't even contact, yet there was a penalty. Do we need travelling stewards to solve this one? Well, Martin, first of all, I didn't see the F3 incident, so I'm afraid I can't comment on that one. But Canada was a totally different affair altogether. And actually, the fact that there was contact in the race in Austria, contact isn't necessarily the problem. Contact isn't necessarily a symptom of foul play. Light contact can just be a symptom of hard, tough, great, close wheel-to-wheel racing. You know, that's not necessarily a bad thing. So contact isn't the problem. And the biggest difference between Canada and the incident that we saw in Austria was that there were two kind of reasons for the penalty for Sebastian Vettel. One was the idea that he came back onto the circuit in an uncontrolled, unsafe manner. Now, of course, that completely doesn't apply to this one because nobody was off the circuit. That's not the issue. And the other was crowding a driver off the track, in that Sebastian Vettel crowded Lewis Hamilton off the circuit. Well, you could throw that one towards potentially towards Max Verstappen. But I have to say, I thought the penalty, and there were other questions on this, so forgive me if I didn't answer your question on this, but let's get into the Max Verstappen penalty. I actually 100% agreed with the stewards in the outcome of that decision today, that it's not a penalty, that we didn't penalise Max Verstappen and we didn't take away his race win. And the reason I say that is because it was such a 50-50 incident, in that, and this is exactly what the stewards concluded, and the wording of their decision talks about the fact they couldn't find one driver wholly or predominantly to blame. And that's because both parties played a part in this incident. Charles Leclerc decided that he was going to contest that corner all the way around the outside. He wasn't going to give it up, even though Max was well alongside him. They were neck and neck going through the apex of the turn. So that was the first big difference. Charles could have backed out. He didn't have to, but he could have done, and he chose not to, which was absolutely his right. Max Verstappen, according to the stewards, and this is what they've said afterwards, is that he was at full lock going around from the apex onwards. He was at full lock. Therefore, that says he wasn't deliberately trying to crowd Charles off the circuit. He wasn't drifting his car on purpose out towards the white line. That's the nature of that corner. And he had so much of his car alongside Charles Leclerc by that point that he also had every right to make that overtake stick, to keep his foot in and keep pushing. So both drivers could have made decisions that would have changed the outcome of that incident, but neither had to within the rules. And so there's this clause in the regulations, which is great. It was introduced for this very reason, to give the stewards a little bit of leeway to not have to punish every single incident, and they've used it to great effect here. No driver was wholly or predominantly to blame for the incident, therefore it goes down as a racing incident. And I'm really pleased that that was the outcome, because if we had punished that, it literally would have signified the end of all racing. No driver could ever be brave enough to take on an attempted overtake, because unless you can get it done before going into the corner, you may as well not bother. That's not the kind of Formula One that we want. That's not the kind of Formula One that us as fans are all screaming out for. We want, and look, half the people, probably a lot more than half the people who've criticised and said that should have been a penalty for Max, were probably the same people calling for better racing, closer racing, wheel-to-wheel action, hard, tough, wheel-banging motorsport. That's what we want to see. And so we can't then have the stewards penalising any attempt on that, when, unless you leave a full car's width to the outside, you're going to get penalised for it, because no one will do it, and we'll never get that kind of racing. So I'm really pleased that the outcome was the way it was. I totally agree with the stewards. Yes, you could have made a case to apply the penalty, and if they'd applied the penalty, you could have looked at the rule book and said, look, this is why they made that decision, and perhaps you can't argue with the stewards for making it. Perhaps we need to look at the rules. But equally, you could have quite easily backed up their decision, the one they made, and said, yes, that was right too. So when a stewarding decision is that close, that much of a fine line, then you can't argue with it. That's top level sport. You've got some decisions that will fall either side of the line, and I have to say, for me, this one fell absolutely the right side of the line. Martin, to answer your question fully, do we need travelling stewards? I actually agree with you. I do think travelling stewards should be part of the remit. I think we should have the same stewards at every Grand Prix, or at least a consistent steward or two at every Grand Prix, because I think consistency is the one thing that everybody does want. Whatever the decisions, we want them to be consistent. I don't think this is inconsistency, because I don't think it's the same incident as what happened in Canada. And if you look at the Canadian incident, you could never say, they couldn't determine whether one driver was wholly or predominantly to blame, because clearly Sebastian Vettel was predominantly to blame there. Lewis Hamilton, in that particular incident, didn't do anything wrong. And so the same rule doesn't apply. So I don't think you can necessarily say the two are the same. Yeah, there are similarities, but they were not the same incident. And I like the fact that stewards are able to judge on a race-by-race, incident-by-incident basis, and make a judgment, based on some kind of common sense as well as looking at the rule book. So I hope that answers the question, and I hope that gives some or at least gives my point of view on the Verstappen-Leclerc incident. I know that Ferrari and Leclerc fans would have been upset by that. We all want to see Charles Leclerc win his first race, but he would not have wanted to win that in the steward's room afterwards. He wants to have his moment, and it will come. It's coming, you know, and I don't think it's too far away. So yeah, he was upset. Totally get that. You know, of course he's upset. He's a racing driver, and with a few laps to go, he was leading that race. But I think when he reflects on it and he looks back, I don't think he'll see it as the wrong decision. He might feel hard done by, but I definitely think he's a sensible kid. He will look at it and go, yeah, I understand why they've made that call. Right, it's now quite late at night, so apologies for the late upload of this video, but I've had quite a lot to do this evening. Let's pick up with this one from Chuck Bartowski, who says, "Hi Mark, we all saw what happened on Vettel's pit, and I want to ask you, who has the fault on this kind of situation? Whose fault was it? The pit crew or the pit wall? Is it some kind of miscommunication? Has that ever happened to you during your time in the sport?" So, that we don't know who the actual fault is. It's almost always a miscommunication. Generally, it tends to be a miscommunication either between the pit wall and the pit crew, but much more common is a miscommunication between the pit wall and the driver, or vice versa, driver and the pit wall. So either the driver comes in unannounced, and that has happened to me before. It can be because of radio communication problems. It can be through a misinterpretation of a pit board signal, something like that. I've had it. The British Grand Prix, I forget the year, maybe 2002. We had massive radio communication troubles. We actually had interference from a local taxi service around Northamptonshire, believe it or not, and we lost radio comms to the drivers. It was a race that was going from wet to dry, and I think we ended up doing something stupid like 7 pit stops with DC because of the changing conditions. And I remember DC coming in, totally surprised us. We were sat in the garage, no one had a clue he was coming in because he'd lost all comms, and the first we knew about it was when he turned up at the pit box outside the front of the garage. And there's a mad scramble to clear the equipment out of the way, get the tyres ready, and of course you look like complete idiots at that point, because when you're watching on as a fan, it just looks like a total mess up, which is of course what it is, but there's almost always a reason for it. It's rarely ever within a Formula 1 team as simple as just a cock up. It's normally some kind of issue, whether it's a technical issue or something like that that's happened. So it's very difficult to apportion blame without knowing all of the circumstances, but it's almost always some kind of fault somewhere in the system that ends up leading to that kind of situation. But yes, I've had it. It's embarrassing, it's awful, it's a horrible situation, mad panic ensues. But one of the things Formula 1 teams are very good at is overcoming problems like that and dealing with them when they're thrown at them. So actually, given the situation, given the scenario, Ferrari probably dealt with that as well as they could with the time frame they had, the amount of notice they had, and what was there available to them in terms of tyres and options. So although it looked like an absolute mess, given the situation that we don't really know, they probably dealt with it as well as they could. And let's have this one from Stuart Grindlay, who says, "Mark, when a car is on full harvest mode, does the car brake harder via engine braking, etc., than when a car would be on full deployment?" So I think the question is, does the engine braking, when you're harvesting energy through the ERS, the energy recovery system, is that feeling of braking harder than when the driver's just slamming on the pedal? And the answer to that is that no, it should feel exactly the same. And that's what the system is there to do. The system compensates for the amount of retardation that the ERS system is putting into the braking system of the car. And when you're not using that ERS system, essentially the ERS system should give the same braking feeling as just the mechanical braking system if you weren't harvesting. For example, if you were on a standard system that didn't have ERS, the feeling should be the same. And it uses a combination of sensors sensing brake pressure, so the driver's pedal demand, how much braking he's requesting from the system, and then rather than just simply being a mechanical transfer or a hydraulic transfer of fluid to the brake system, it uses a system of sensors to replicate that same amount of retardation, that same feeling. And the idea being that the driver shouldn't really notice too much of a difference, whether it's ERS braking, engine braking, or mechanical hydraulic braking. On the subject of pit stops, SJ says, did anyone else notice on Lewis Hamilton's pit stop they changed 4 wheels without using a front jack, and they changed the front wing? Have they got some sort of side jack now? Well, SJ, yeah, so yes, what you're talking about is when they did the nose change. They were taking the nose off and at the same time lifted the car up to change the 4 wheels, whereas normally the front jack would go under the front wing to lift the car up. So the question is there something like a side jack? Yes, there is. Actually, side jacks have been around for many, many years, even before I was involved in the sport. So 20 years we've had side jacks. You just don't see them very often. And actually in a pit stop, because there's so much else going on, one of those pit stops where actually most of the focus from a fan or media perspective is focusing on the front wing change, there's a side jack going in from the side, which is a very simple cantilever jack that just lifts the car off the ground that way. Then of course once the nose is on, they put do up the catches on the nose, the 4 wheels are already changed by that point, they can lower it down and off it goes. So it's a very simple system, but it's probably the best way to do it when you don't have a nose on the car. Same thing applies when the car comes in with a broken nose or missing its front wing. There's nothing there to lift the regular front jack up with. So that's how they do it, side jack. Right, Maria asks this one. Hi Mark, what do you think about the use of DRS on lapped drivers? I mean, Max won because of that and Charles was unlucky to not get a good DRS from somebody in front. Not fair. Okay, Maria. Well, let me quickly say, Max definitely did not win because he picked up DRS from a lap driver, and Charles didn't not win for that same reason. I'm sure there was assistance from those areas, and that was good or bad depending on which side of the fence you sit, but it wasn't the reason Max won that race. I absolutely agree with you. I don't think it's fair. I don't think we should be picking up DRS from lap drivers. It's there to assist an overtake. And an overtake, is, in my book, is not when you get past a lapped driver. That's just par for the course. They're already getting blue flags to get out of your way. That's not an overtake. It doesn't need DRS. Shouldn't really be playing a part in your lap time and the rest of your race. So in my book, I would get rid of that. I would totally have that outlawed and only pick up DRS when you're racing somebody for position. But yeah, I don't think Max won for that very reason. There were many other reasons Max won that race. It wasn't because he picked up DRS from a back marker. Leaf Bolskift says this one. Drivers have multiple layers on their visor to tear off during the race. How does F1 keep the lenses clean on the cameras that are mounted on the cars? Well, actually the very same way, more or less. The cameras, the onboard cameras, have a rotating clear screen that passes over the lens of the camera. And if you get a fly splat or some rubber or some dirt and dust, the producers, or the director rather, can see that on his monitor. He can call for that to be rotated. They press a button and remotely there's a little motor inside that rotates the screen over the lens until you get to a nice clean bit, and then it's nice and clear again. That's kind of how they do it. Right, 2 to finish on. Let's start with this one quickly. Matthew Butcher. Curbs, fair or unfair? Should they be introduced at more tracks? 100% fair. If you don't like them as a driver, stay off them. If they're going to break your car, stay off them. If there was a wall there, you wouldn't go near it because it would break your car. Well, if you know those giant sausage curbs are going to do the same, don't go near them. So yes, absolutely fair. Let's have more of them. I love it. And finally, Kirky Worky says, do you think controlled spoilers and wings would bring the cars any closer together racing-wise? Yes, I do. I've mentioned this before. I've got a controversial opinion on this. For me, looking at the future of Formula One, standardising aero is a definite option for me. I think it's an area we spend too much money on, an area that fans can't really see too much difference in. They can't comprehend the detailed nature of aerodynamics. We spend hundreds of thousands, if not millions, on developing tiny little flick-ups and flaps, and all that ends up doing is making the racing more difficult because cars can't follow each other. So yeah, for me, let's standardise aero. We can then, as a sport, we can control how that looks, how the cars will then operate, how close they are, how close they're able to follow each other, because we have total control over it. We can design a package that will allow great racing. The teams can save an awful lot of money that they can then put into other areas, and let's innovate. Let's be at the forefront of innovation in Formula One, but let's innovate in other areas that are more relevant to the wider world, whether it's software, whether it's material science, whether it's some kind of active suspension components, whatever it might be. I don't know what the answer is, but let's put all of that R&D money that we spend on aero and put it into other areas of technology that might be, that we might be able to break ground in the wider world. Aero is not something that's that transferable to the wider world. It's very Formula One specific, and yet we spend by far the biggest portion of our budget on it. We've got wind tunnels in every factory running, constantly all year round at huge cost, at huge environmental impact. There are so many better ways that we could be absolute cutting edge innovators in Formula One than in aero, in my opinion. Right, didn't actually have any questions on this, but I just want to give a big shout out to everyone at McLaren for their performance at the moment. Lando Norris and Carlos Sainz both did an incredible job, and it's really nice to see McLaren having turned a corner. So massive shout out to everybody at Woking. Well done. Right, let's give away this epic print. How good was this? We had a Max Verstappen print by Alex Stutchbury. Here it is. And Max went on, of course, to win the race in dramatic style. Lots of you entered this one because it is a fantastic prize. So I'm now going to pick one at random from everybody who entered using the right hashtag, sharing it on Twitter. We're going to stop it there. And that is Matt. Let's see. R34 Perman. Matt, I will message you directly, but you have just won yourself that Max Verstappen print. I'll find out where you are because I can't see from the moment, but I will message you directly. Well done, congratulations. You've done everything, yeah, hashtag, yeah. Well done, Matt, congrats. Thank you to everybody who took part. Thank you for all of the questions this week. There were loads and loads and loads as ever. I didn't get to go through anywhere near all of them, but thank you, appreciate them all. Hope you enjoyed the weekend and the race as much as I did, and I'll catch you very soon. Ta-ra.